So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you for the 28th edition of the German Prevention Congress in Mannheim. We know the crises we have been confronted with in the past few years, like climate change and public demonstrations. Prevention plays a very important role for us and for our society in order to become resilient. Thank you very much for your participation. Today we have a lot of experts who will provide their contribution and their expertise and experiences in order to find shared solutions. We have a responsibility. We have to pool our resources in order to make our society more resilient. I know and I hope that this Congress will provide you with insights in order to develop new solutions. A crisis should not be considered only as a threat, but also as an opportunity. Thank you very much for your participation, and I wish you a profitable and rich Congress. Thank you. So this was my task on ChatGPT. And, well, it was everything okay. I didn't have to correct anything, basically. But then a dear colleague of mine took my voice and he added this voice into another app. So he uploaded my voice into another app, and this was the result. I didn't read that myself, and this is artificial intelligence, that ChatGPT, and I think we should tackle these issues also within the framework of prevention. This could be a good insight for the next Congress. Well, let's see future developments. But let's start now correctly. Well, it was correct, actually, but let's start the traditional way. I'd like to greet you all, and I would like to introduce you to Professor Stephan Harbarth, the chairman of the Federal Constitutional Court. Then we have the Deputy Minister President and Minister of the Interior of the State Baden-Württemberg, Thomas Strobl. Professor Gina Wollinger. Our expertise, our expert appraiser, and Mr. Peter Kurz, Mayor of the city of Mannheim. So we are very grateful for having such authoritative representatives of prevention here today. They come from different sectors, from politics, society, culture, and they accepted our invitation. So, well, they would deserve individual introductions, because we know that prevention is something individual. And when the boss engages him or herself in the first place, it is much better to fulfill the needs and the requests. Unfortunately, I cannot greet all of you because I would forget the names, and I would hardly remember all the names in alphabetical order. And for this reason, we decided to focus on that variant. I know you cannot read it, but you can follow up on the website. In any case, we are very grateful for having so many authoritative personalities here today in Mannheim. And in particular, I would like to say hello to our international guests. Well, this is a map that shows not so much what is going to happen today and tomorrow, but rather the countries that have been participating in the past 28 years to our Congress. And here you see the percentages, and you see, well, of course, you cannot have the entire world represented in a Congress, but you see that we have about 200 colleagues coming from foreign delegations, and so they represent 32 countries. So I think they deserve an applause, in particular for our international guests. And last but not least, I'd like to mention EFUS. For those who have already taken part in our congresses, know about the contests. Well, France has won, for example, and so this year we decided to focus on EFUS because EFUS is actually present with the management. So I'd like to greet the chair of EFUS. He is, by the way, the mayor of Liège, then Elizabeth Johnson, the secretary, and the 3 deputy chair people. And in particular, Christian Specht, whom I would like to thank in particular, because we have to thank him for being here in the city of Mannheim, and we have to thank also EFUS because, well, the general meeting is taking place in Mannheim after many years. We used to have the general meeting in Berlin. And then I also would like to thank our partner organizations. We have 40, well, 2 federal ministries, the Ministry for Justice and the Ministry for Family Affairs, who have always been supported us, the region of Baden-Württemberg, the city of Mannheim, and all the other partner organizations such as the Weissering, Propeka, and the the Society for the International Cooperation, and then, of course, all the other partners involved. Thank you very much. If you want, we have a couple of suggestions for hashtags and social media. Well, I still remember it was, I think, 5 years ago, we said, well, have you seen? We have a post in Facebook with some likes. And now it is no longer an exception because Facebook has become something for the older generations. Well, Instagram, I don't know. TikTok, well, I have no idea what it is all about. But these are the modern social media where our positive topics can be uploaded. Crisis and prevention. This is our focus topic for this year. And as it is the case every year, our main topic is going to be particularly important. But we cannot cover everything. We have different formats. As you can see, this is just an excerpt of the different formats that we have. You see that in the internet that we have about 3,000 people and about 1/3 of them are students. So if you have a particular interest, you can read them. You can read everything afterwards. But within the framework of these formats, prevention is going to be tackled. And prevention is our focus topic, and not only because we developed a study, but because we have all the speakers who will have the chance of, who had the chance of reading that study to realize what the current situation from a scientific viewpoint is. And, you know, in the past, people were a bit bored because everything started from Adam and Eve and everything was detailed. But in this case, we have a great summary of crisis and prevention, and we've also reflected upon how to present this topic. Well, prevention is a fire prevention. It's not a fire extinguisher. You know my my motto, let's say, and so you can also you can also play a very important role in this respect if you are experts in the field of fire prevention. You can even win a prize because we have many different instruments which have nothing to do with prevention, for example, a fire cover or other tools. We decided to opt for a picture that represents this topic at best. And so we have developed such a picture. And what can we do with that picture? You can discuss about this with your colleagues, with your families. Well, if your children ask you, where were you, Mama? And what did you talk about? Well, we talked about prevention. There were many people. So in this case, you see that the central crisis that the experts have focused on within the framework of this study are represented here. So in the middle, you see the climate situation, but we haven't overcome the coronavirus pandemic entirely. And you see that we have the war and we have other situations, fair situations. We have the refugees, and then you see the bridge, and the river. So we have decided not to focus on every single sector, stating and maintaining that we have a solution for prevention. And that's basically the task that we have for this Congress. There's enough room in this picture so that we can add some things and we can discuss about the chances for prevention in the relevant situations. And this is basically the topic of today's workshop. Stephan Ebmeyer is a journalist. He works for ARD, SWR, and so he has been dealing with internet-related crime a lot. So I do not know many details about him, but he has been moderating a lot of workshops for us. So you have the floor. So thank you very much, Erich. So we've seen climate crisis, Ukraine crisis, inflation crisis, migration crisis. So crisis, and these are just the crises we have been dealing with in the past 3 years. So crises are becoming increasingly frequent. They are changing. They are becoming increasingly global. And in other words, there are many people who are impacted at the same time and very quickly. What does this imply for us as human beings, for the society, for politics? How can we cope with that? How can we prepare ourselves? And how can we react as preventive as possible? And this is going to be the topic of today. Let's start with the crisis that has been particularly engaging us a lot. And let me start with Mr. Strobl. You were confronted with the coronavirus pandemic. You were in a hospital, and you had pulmonary embolic disorders. How did this personally change you? So first of all, thank you and good morning. Well, this is a very personal question. You start with a very personal question. And let me say, God has helped me a lot. Well, he decided to admit me to hospital, not in a simple ward, but in the ICU. I had thromboembolic disorders, lung problems, and so on and so forth. And when you experience such things, everything becomes of relative importance. If we consider today's debates saying that the coronavirus pandemic was actually painless and that was invented and something that went around in society. But my personal experience is that this is a very subtle and dangerous disease that requires protection for the population. And this is what we have tried to do with the utmost attention. And concerning my personal experience, I can say that, well, you should not take for granted what prevention is and what prevention should be. And you should not take for granted the fact that we live in peace and and that humanity and human life has become obvious. And after so many years, we have painfully realized that this is no longer the case. We have wars in Europe. And if I go back to the initial statement, well, you have mentioned 5, 6, 7 crises which are going on at the same time, one after the other: the COVID pandemic, the energy crisis, the Ukraine crisis, and so on and so forth. But you both did not mention one crisis, and this is particularly concerning for me, and this is the crisis of democracy. Our democracy is under strong pressure from the outside. The war caused by Putin is not only a local war, but a war against the way we live, against our democratic principles. Well, and there are others who fight with that type of war, but without warfare instruments. But our democracy is under pressure, also internally, due to left-wing extremism, Islamic radical approaches, and conspiracy ideologists. The anti-Semitic narratives. Yes, but if I can stay on the coronavirus pandemic, well, I think it's a great political crisis as well, because decisions have to be made very quickly sometimes, and then suddenly the situation changes. So it is not clear, and it also changes very quickly. How did you cope with that? We have tried to make evidence-based decisions based on scientific insights, and you always have to consider two aspects. Science doesn't exist per se, because there are different scientific theories. And secondly, well, science changes its opinion that's inherent to science. Something which was believed to be the case today can be totally changed the day after. And this is also the case for politicians who make up their mind very quickly. So in summary, I can say that in Germany, Baden-Württemberg, we managed to overcome the COVID pandemic very well. Well, for sure, not all decisions were good, but we have based our decisions on the main scientific opinions, on the opinion of the leading virologists. And I think this was the right decision, because it was not a question of making people angry because we limited their freedom. I think all people have realized that this was not the case. All limitations have been removed. And if I consider the international scenario, especially the autocratic systems and not the democratic systems, and if I look at the way they coped with COVID pandemic, I must say that we as democratic systems managed to overcome this crisis very well. But you said that not all things were correct. So with hindsight, what can we do better the next time something like that happens? Is there anything that you would make differently? Are there any lessons that we can draw from the past? Well, that's difficult because we do not know what the next crisis is going to be. And first of all, I think we have to prepare ourselves for the crisis. And well, back in 2020, experts were up to this task. They had to develop new scenarios. I think we have to prepare ourselves very much, but we hope no further crises break out. But if so, we have to focus on intervention. And that's good that we, in 2018, 5 years before, we had a drilling on gas shortage. People smiled when we made this experiment and we made this drilling on gas shortage. So we simulated that situation. And by the way, Baden-Württemberg is the only region in Germany which is ready for such EU drilling, because crisis management should be internationalized. A crisis doesn't stop at the borders, as it was the case for previous crises. We have to strengthen our European bonds. Crisis has to become a European topic, and if approved by the European Commission in the next years, we will carry out an earthquake drilling, an earthquake simulation on the Rhine, and we will also consider shortages of different kinds, and this is very important. So drilling exercises are very important for crisis management at an international level, and then the involvement of the citizenship. So there shouldn't be only exercises with the people, with the stakeholder, with the people involved, and with the task forces, but we should also involve the population. Professor Harbarth, at court, you also have to control politicians, and this was also the case during the COVID pandemic. You had to check different decisions by the politicians, and what were the most important challenges for you in that period? During the pandemic, and this applies both to the Federal Constitutional Court and to the administrative courts. During the pandemic, the courts had the task of controlling. They didn't have the task of developing things, of laying out concepts and plans based on the best opinion of the court on how to overcome the pandemic crisis. And when we have the task of check the political activities based on basic rights, we immediately realize, as you already hinted at, that the specificities of this crisis, of the pandemic, that is, the uncertainties on how to fight against that, this put both politicians and the court under great pressure. In the beginning, Marx said by right that prevention is fire prevention. It should not be considered as a fire extinguisher, but rather as a fire prevention measure. And this shows what were the major difficulties during the COVID pandemic. We knew very well how to cope with fire, and by contrast, we didn't have particular experiences on how to fight against that special virus. And this is a virus that does not only impacts on animals, but also on human beings. And this is a virus that jeopardized important legal assets, life and health of human beings. And during the pandemic, nobody knew what the best way was to fight effectively against the virus. And so within the framework of the court control, in a pandemic situation, you have on the one hand to control. On the other hand, you also have to acknowledge that politicians and political decision makers are confronted with a completely new situation. And that's why they need a certain discretion. Well, the judiciary cannot simply say there's just one variant, just one solution. We know we have to realize that there's a lot of uncertainty on how to cope with a crisis caused by the pandemic. And so the idea was to make sure that the judicial control was there. And so we introduced the so-called Bundesnotbremse, and this measure was then enshrined into the federal constitution. We also eliminated some other measures, for example, the ban on demonstrations. So I think that somehow this pandemic shows how prevention is important from a constitutional viewpoint, because we had a lot of restrictions of our basic rights, and well, the fact that basic rights were restricted has to do with the fact that this pandemic was completely new, and we were not prepared in 2020 when it broke out. And so we reacted as best as we could, and for this reason we needed to implement some restrictions that we may not have implemented if we had been prepared. But what were the difficulties? Time issues or those restrictions? Because you said, well, everything was very uncertain. Well, for us as a court, we had a lot of practical difficulties. So, for example, one of the challenges was that only part of the staff could work locally and could be at the workplace. But this was also the case for many other jobs and institutions. Another important challenge was that considering the measures that were adopted and considering that restrictions were imposed on important constitutional assets. On the one hand, in the implementation of those measures, we had to consider the protection of those important principles. And so we had to find a compromise between restrictions and freedom, and we had to do so in a very short period of time. And so in conclusion, I think we should reflect upon the lessons that we can draw from for future crises. So, for example, the climate change crisis. Well, climate change does not happen overnight, as it was the case for the COVID pandemic. But we have realized that the later we are, the more massive the restrictions will be. And for this reason, one of the lessons that we can draw from that crisis, from the COVID pandemic, for future crises and for future pandemics, for future climate change crises, is that an early reaction, defining early measures in order to reduce damage and restrictions as possible is very important also from a constitutional viewpoint, because if we react late, we must necessarily restrict the constitutional rights that we have. Is there one lesson in particular? So if you look back, what can we say? Because, well, you know, for climate change, we have a lot of indicators, but not a real system. We do not have a concept in place. Well, we know that climate change is impacting the entire world because temperatures are rising all over the world. So the idea is to reduce and mitigate climate change as early as possible. But we also have to adapt to warmer temperatures at the same time. Well, considering that I'm sitting next to the mayor, we also have urban design measures that have to be taken into account, because we also have to react in cities with green concepts, with water, with more vegetation and green in the cities, in order to reduce the stress of living in cities and towns. During the COVID pandemic, for example, we do not know how the next virus will spread, but the COVID pandemic has shown the weaknesses that we still have in our society. Let's think about digitization, for example. In the beginning, it was so difficult when we had to work from home, and when lessons at school could not take place any longer, and so they had to be replaced through digital formats. These are all lessons that we can draw from the COVID crisis, because digitization has made a lot of progress, and so we've realized that digitization had to be implemented much more quickly than in the past. Because, well, if on one day schools are closed, we have to have digital formats available that can be implemented immediately in order to reduce the impact for children. We have realized that in that sector a lot of problems arose, and the idea is to minimize as much as possible those problems next time something happens. So the question mark is how to organize the digital tools and so on and so forth if the next crisis comes. And I think there are measures that can already be described and that can be implemented next time too. So yes, that's a very good example, and it's clear. So it is unacceptable that courts can no longer function or schools can no longer function. What about you, Professor? What about the university? You have observed everything from a scientific viewpoint. What are the major insights that you can draw from the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I believe that we have been able to draw some lessons in terms of prevention of crises. So I could say that through the corona pandemic, we saw that we can show solidarity. We can have a positive attitude. For example, the way neighborhoods manage to engage within the communities. But we need to have one common ground to actually uphold those values through crises. So this is important when talking about crisis prevention. What are the factors that actually spur such behaviors? And an elementary element is the following: how we go about our social identity in such a crisis. So the point is that we want to avoid the fact that, for example, differences at a social level way become way bigger. So we need to protect people who might be the losers, so to speak, in such a context. Of course, there were uncertainties and there were different opinions, different experts that expressed their mind about that. But this is an intimate element, as we have seen with the pandemic, and it's going to happen again in the next few years. So the phenomenon of a complex crisis is actually difficult to define, and this has an impact onto the society as well. So sometimes it is difficult to grasp. So we see that this has an impact onto our everyday lives. So for example, in our everyday life, let's say that the climate crisis can have a direct impact when I'm driving my car, for example, and I need to stop because of a heavy rain. It is also very important to actually have the trust needed when we are led by, for example, experts who are studying such crises. So we're talking about the coronavirus or climate crisis, we need to spur discussions and exchange our minds so that we can understand how to go about it. So in prevention, we need those competencies, those skills, so that we can actually go about it based on facts to avoid fake news as we know it. So we need to understand the causes that are entailed in such crises that are difficult sometimes to grasp and fathom, as we said. So in the corona pandemic, we also saw that when we don't fully understand the situation, it is difficult to fathom why the reason why such a thing has happened and how we can actually deal with it. So the world is difficult to understand all of a sudden. And this entails risks, for example, because we feel like we don't have control over our life anymore. But this is also connected to racism, stereotypes, the fact that we're always blaming it on somebody else. That is something what we saw with conspiracy theories during the crises or anti-Semitism. And so if you put this all together, it is difficult to understand how we should go about it. And it's therefore of paramount importance that we understand what is going on, that we exchange our skills, that we explain things both with adults but also with children and younger generations, so that such prevention can also entail the enhancement of skills. These are relevant points to actually avoid the increase of such elements that we have talked about, pertaining to identity, pertaining to the different perspectives that we have in life, so that we can avoid drifting away, so to speak. So this is something that we have observed through the corona crisis, and that is something that we can practically then set into practice for the future as well. So this is something that has to do also with institutions. What are the concrete points that need to be taken into account in such a context? Well, communication is of paramount importance. Crisis communication. So we need to find a number of levels so that we can communicate correctly at a number of levels, as we said, not just with state stakeholders in terms of preventative actions, but also spurring a more participation-based behavior. So, for example, so that volunteers can be on board. And on top of communication about crises, we can also think about how we can further strengthen our human capital. So we have seen that we need to identify in a transparent way what vulnerable groups are. And we can actually put that into practice in a number of ways. So at an international level as well. But I believe that this is something that we needed to go about at a local level as well with the municipalities. So in the different neighborhoods, we can reinforce the human capital so that we can spur this exchange amongst the citizens and with the institutions so that we can come up with stronger systems. And I believe that from a concrete viewpoint, there is a lot to be done. There is a lot that can be done to actually face future crises. Yes, so you are the mayor of the city of Mannheim. You have been so since 2017, dear Peter Kurz. So what was for you maybe the most important event in such a context? Well, actually, quite a few things would be to mention. If we talk about the period 2015-2017, the financial crisis and the coronavirus crisis entails a whole different dimension, actually. So it has impacted all aspects of our everyday life, every institution, and on the long run and in very concrete ways. So for us, we had actually to face a huge workload over the working week, for example, but we had to face such a situation over 3 years, and then we went back to normality in a way, but the consequences were still to be found. From this perspective, we can see that we've acted in a dynamic way, but as you have said, we need to actually base our decisions on the lessons that we've actually managed to understand. So we lack maybe a process that can help us. So we need to understand what went well on the number of levels that we have taken into account. And this is something that we need to do. So maybe like in a document, but this is maybe too big of ambition, but this is something that we need to do. So we need to find some common ground. And also taking into account the downsides of it. So what happened over the 3 years that we have analyzed? So we need to understand what happened and what actually went well, what we managed to come up with, but also what went lost over time, over the past 3 years. So as we have stated, so we need to focus on the local level. So this conscience that is created can be utilized everywhere. If we talk about climate, if we talk about other types of crises, so localization, acting local, this is something which is of paramount importance and absolutely crucial. So the pandemic created also context in which we as municipalities could actually spur this dialogue with one another, so on a number of levels, as we said, in the preparation works, and then going further into details, for example. So we really had to work overnight to actually find a solution to all possible problems at a financial level, at a management level, and so on and so forth. So we managed to find solutions. So this is what I wanted to say. And obviously, we're talking about extraordinary situations. However, we need to be active. We need to be ready to react, to actually have a positive impact. And so we still need to come up with stronger systems in this framework. So, for example, multi-level governance, a number of levels entailed the organization of thereof, and then the interplay of the different political actors. So this could be a positive starting point for the future that we can further build on. So then, second topic, communication. As we've said time and again, I believe that politics and the state in such a condition managed to move on in a positive way. So, but actually, such interventions that were introduced were actually finally understood and applied. So this was a form of agility that we can build on, as we said. So on the both sides of what I've just referred to. So for the future, we need to spur consensus, as we said, and we need to be ready to communicate in an open and transparent way. We need to be ready to actually redirect our actions. We need to identify further options thereof. That is what will reinforce our position and empower everyone to actually act. This is something that we managed to do. So, and we also published articles in the FCT, and we try to understand how agile we can be as things progressed. So, considering the impact of the virus onto the many levels of societal context as seasons change. So, we needed to actually go about it week by week, creating further problems, for example, in the concrete management of the everyday life, when we talk about the different businesses that had to stay closed. So there were people who said, I can't go on this way if I can work, obviously, if my business can't reopen. So we actually tried to face such extreme situations in which week by week we needed to adapt our actions. And that is what I mean when I mention we need to stay agile, we need to be flexible. So actually, this is also part of this agility culture, if you want to define it that way. Of course, as a politician, of course, we do not come across as extremely positive or extremely popular when actions and interventions are taken into account and implemented, and then we understand that they were not exactly the right ones and they need to be redirected. Yeah, of course. However, I think that a positive element is that we can identify such situations and actually try and improve the way we handle, because we also have to face uncomfortable truths somehow, so that we can try and protect our society. So there are different signals that sometimes are not the correct ones, and we need to take that into account as well, as we all know, as you stated before. So in the future, we'll still have to face similar issues, maybe another pandemic. That is the reason why those topics must be formulated in such a way that they are dealt with in a critical way and that they're conveyed to the citizens. So this is actually what we tried to do. So yesterday in the news, we read an article which was quite critical that had to do with a big event in the gastronomy sector. So, for example, not the staff speaks German. So what happened in this industry over the pandemic? We didn't have enough workforce. So this is another element that is not talked about enough at a societal level and also in the media. So this has an impact onto the mutual expectations. So we need to acknowledge, first of all, what the situation looks like. So that's the same thing that happened, for example, in the healthcare sector as well. So in terms of workload. So it was a huge challenge that needed to be dealt with. These are not things to be taken for granted, but the fact that we can acknowledge all those issues and how they went and how we went about it, this can help us become more resilient for the next crises. And so I read the expert document and the Mannheim Declaration that will be published. Well, that entailed the topic of social capital, which is the most important element here. So trust is of paramount importance for such issues. How do we go about crises? So, and how we can avoid such trust from being a situation in which such trust is eroded by those negative experience that sometimes we have to go through. So crises can impact our society in a number of ways, in different ways, and there are social inequalities that need to be taken into account, vulnerable groups that need to be taken into account. Köln and Mannheim were the first cities that reacted in a different, specific way per neighborhood. So this is something that was not dealt with, for example, right from the beginning. So depending on the different walks of life, we try to understand how the breakout behaved in a way and how it moved. So we tried to understand how the different societal layers would be impacted by those risky situations. And it took a while before we actually managed to react in an adequate way. So this is a learning for us, a take-home message, how we can reinforce our activities throughout crises. So you have talked about an interesting point. So, for example, this crisis hasn't really been re-elaborated. Is this something that will happen? Is this something that will be done maybe later on? But maybe since we are in a mega crisis, which is maybe not over yet, is taking us into the next one. So maybe we're facing something that was not thinkable in the past. So yeah, actually we are all here in a big congress, and this had to do with the re-elaboration of this issue. So how will we go about future crises? As we've said time and again, this is quite clear, but this wish for normality, going back to normality, a normal situation, plays a role. So actually We have talked about vulnerable groups. This is something that we can build on, and the identification of the different vulnerable groups that needs to be made more transparent, because somehow this entails a subjective perspective. What type of risks are entailed? What type of risks are discussed upon? Are we talking about children development? Are we talking about the financial aspects only? So are we talking about society aspects only? So all those aspects are part of the discussions, and it need to be part of the discussion and the dialogue. So what groups are vulnerable and how this might change over time as those crises develop further. So children and young people, how will they further develop? This was also a topic throughout a prevention congress. So the different elements that impact such aspects. So a group that was really impacted on by the corona crisis because they had the feeling nothing really was going on, nothing much was happening. So connecting to schools and also considering the pedagogical aspects for people and young people who had psychological issues, experienced such as psychological issues, how we could compensate those issues throughout a phase which is specifically important in children and youngsters' development. So, for example, everything that needed to be offered so that actually we could make up for the time that was lost to them, like for example school trips or any free time activities. So this is always obviously another aspect that has to do with those groups, but not to speak about the learnings in the school and so on and so forth. So when we go back to a normal or normalish situation, we can actually try and understand what we can do in the future. So juvenile criminality, for example, this is something to be taken into account as well. But we can also see that this generation went through something which is quite specific and that we should actually further analyze. So this is a relevant point. Thank you very much. So actually, I cannot take this picture away from my mind, all those playgrounds that were almost scene of a crime and that couldn't be accessed. So yeah, we talked about democracy and the fact that our society is actually drifting away. We're drifting apart. So people who look like they have a problem with democracy and who feel detached from the state, how would you go about those issues? So the most important point that I would like to underline is that the individuals in our democracies need to understand that there is something to lose. So therefore, we should protect our democracy. We're all part of. So it is important throughout crises to protect, as we said, democracy and show its importance. And individuals also have the right to claim that the state actually deals with such situations in the best possible ways, not to come across as too feeble, for example. That is the reason why we are here to talk about prevention. This is the Prevention Congress, and that is what can help us in preparing for the next phase. And we need a democracy in which we can rely, for example, on the police. Our police officers protect every day our democracy. That is the reason why we need police officers who are well equipped and well trained. Thank you very much for this round of applause that goes out to our police officers, and rightly so. So we need to protect our constitution. As we said, we need a sort of an alarm system there. So we were the first country which actually decided to take into account the different perspectives of the conspiracy theorists, as we said, because this gave way to a toxic mix of conspiracy theories, of expressions of anti-Semitism, of right-wing extremisms, and so on and so forth. And this gives way to new phenomena that will further develop. And in my position, I believe that this is a point of paramount importance. The deciding side of it is that this society, every individual in our society, can actually fully grasp what this means to empower and further strengthen our democracy, to protect it further. So we talked about being resilient, for example, and we also talked about the relationship with the social, with the state reaction and the state help. So our constitution after the Weimar Republic and the Nazi times established a legal framework. So we have the so-called Ewigkeitsgarantie, so warranty for eternity, as we call it in Germany, which is something very specific to our legal context. We have tools like things that are prohibited for the different parties, and so we have a bundle of interventions and that can be set into practice to actually protect the constitution from its enemies, to enhance all the rights connected to the different individual freedoms, to avoid such constitution from being instrumentalized, so to speak. So we do have quite a few tools that empower us in our fight against the enemies of our democracy. At the end, the burning question is the following. So the passion of our society, the passion of every individual for our democracy and all the values that are connected to it. Is it enough to actually act in such a way? So in a different situation, we would actually have the legal tools contained in the Constitution to face the situation and avoid that such a thing as we saw during the Weimar Republic can actually happen again. Why did it fail? The Weimar Constitution did not really get to the heart of the individuals in the society, and most of all to the heart of the elites of the time. So we need to convince people. We know that democracy can be tough. That's a lot of work, as we know. So maybe you would like to do something else on a Sunday instead of going to the poll and actually cast your vote. So this can actually be considered in a very positive way and spur a kind of happiness because we are supporting our democracy in such a way. So this is a burning value, if you will. So we live in a world in which we need to remind ourselves that, as we said, democracy, our freedoms, and the state of law, as we said, are menaced. And they are pushed to the side in a way. So, as we said, in the 90s, the situation completely changed from this point, and now, as we said, those three elements that actually move in a completely different direction. Instead of being pushed forwards, they are moving backwards. So in many other eras in our history, we could see that those three elements were not restricted to one area only. They actually spread throughout continents and throughout the world. So what happened in 48, 49, for example, was a movement that actually spread over the whole continent. That was not something pertaining to our state only. So those three elements, for the ones that are under a completely different system or that benefit from such a profit, well, those three elements are pushed to the side, as we said, and that is the reason why, in terms of internal affairs, it is of paramount importance that we actually gather to reinforce such aspects, that we engage ourselves to support them at an international level. We need to understand what other countries share the same values and the same ideas considering democracy and everything that comes with it, since they are being limited elsewhere in the world. That is the reason why we need to understand that this is a common fight that we need to go about together. Here in Germany, for example, together with the other actors at an international level.
Well, you mentioned the heart. You said everything has to work also from a heart perspective, because at the end of the day, we have to do with human beings and with economic forces that are immune against such forces. So how can we bring these people back? Well, I think we should add one thing, because you all focused on attitudes and on values, but this is just one side, because, well, human beings depend on the personality, on the values, but also on the situation we are confronted with. And for this reason, we have to consider how a situation is perceived. So I may have democratic values, for example, but due to the war, everything becomes unfair, non-transparent, you lose the control. And for this reason, you may be prone to acting differently. Well, for example, during the COVID pandemic, there were people saying, we no longer want democracy. And some others said, well, I do not see any democracy any longer. And they mentioned all possible comparisons. So in this case, I think this was an issue with the perception of the situation. It's not because you do not have those values, but this may also explain specific activities, and this is also important for prevention. It is important to have values and attitudes, but it's also important to create structures that tackle the issue of perceiving the situation the right way, because there may be people who do not fully understand what is going on. So there are many points that have already been tackled. So that's important for communication, for the development of skills. But for radical people, well, you know, there are many people who exploit the fake news, this loss of orientation for their interest. Again, so. I know that this is something basic, but that we absolutely need. So Erich mentioned ChatGPT and the importance of artificial intelligence. So we are surrounded by many possibilities for incurring alienation. And for this reason, we have to understand how to focus on sources, on different opinions and different types of perceptions. So one of the key words that I could also read in the study was ambiguity tolerance, a very complicated expression, but it's basically the fact of understanding and realizing that there are ambiguities. This has to do with the gaps in our society, and well, tolerance for ambiguity means tolerating and understanding different viewpoints, different life experiences. It has nothing to do with tolerance, but simply with the fact of accepting that other people are different from us. And this also means having an attitude whereby something which I do not know is not necessarily wrong or false, because we tend to read what is easily to be confirmed, what can be experienced, and this is something that I can that applies to myself as well when I read the newspaper, and this is also justified by psychology. So the idea is to have an attitude of openness vis-à-vis other people's viewpoints and opinions, and also to carry out a sort of criticism in order to correct any deviations that a person may have. And I think this is absolutely fair in the framework we are discussing. Right, so I think we have discussed all these different topics, but now we have a short break with a short video clip by Lisa Pei.
Dear participants of the German Prevention Congress, dear listeners, warm greetings from Berlin. Crises and prevention, that is your focus for this year. And yes, this is an important topic right now, for us as a society and for us here in the Ministry of Society. In multiple crises like today, climate crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, war in Ukraine, worldwide refugee movements, yes, even democracies like ours come under social pressure. Especially now, it is important to strengthen our open and diverse society. It is now especially important to defend it. And we do that with the federal program Leave Democracy, for example, by working with young people in a preventative way so that they don't drift into conspiracy narratives. And we do this by involving children and youths and young adults more and listening to them. They need our solidarity right now. With our future package for movement, culture and health, young people can implement their own ideas, apply project funding and actively shape their immediate living environment. We have already received many applications for great projects, but children and young people can still submit project applications until the 15th of September, and our mental health coaches will empower students. They train self-confidence, self-assurance and mental health. In the coming school year, we will reach several 10,000 young people nationwide. We write prevention big, just like the prevention congresses. I wish you a successful congress and exciting discussions. Truly yours, Lisa Paus.
So, well, she mentioned a very important issue, mental health, but I think this will be the focus of another panel. So, in conclusion, I'd like to briefly tackle the issue of climate change. Well, we have already hinted at this issue, but it is becoming increasingly important. So, Mr. Kurz, what does it mean, for example, for the city of Mannheim? How do you tackle this problem, and how are you preparing yourselves? Well, in this case, we have to be extremely ambitious, but also very active. We are now part of EU-wide vision with 100 cities which gathered in order to be pilot projects and to develop their models in order to put this into practice, because in the past few years we have realized that under such a pressure that we described, ambition increases. And for this reason, we have become increasingly ambitious. But well, of course, well, ambition and reality and the gap between the two is becoming wider and wider. And for this reason, we have to take concrete measures to fill that gap. We have a climate plan that we are implementing. It's a sort of agreement that we have signed with the region, with the participation of the EU. And this is very important for an industrialized city in order to reach climate neutrality in the short term. So this means we have to reduce by 80% the greenhouse gas emissions and with compensation measures, of course, so we cannot obtain a full neutrality by 2030, but with compensation measures, we can accelerate the process. And thanks to these measures, we can we can be extremely effective. And as it was the case for the COVID pandemic, we have to cooperate at all different levels in order to realize what decision levers we have. Well, in real estate, in the real estate sector, for example, we are discussing the contribution that real estate can provide to mitigating climate change. But this is something that has to be included in the planning phase. And so the refurbishment of buildings is important, but it is so huge that we will never be able to reach these levels. So we have, for example, regulations from the EU providing for the refurbishment of buildings in order to focus on energy efficiency. Unfortunately, we also have to realize that all buildings are also connected to a heating grid that has to be decarbonized. So I can refurbish the buildings, but if I do not decarbonize the energy grid, the heating grid, we will never be able to reach our objectives. So in other words, the regulations are coming from above, and the measures that are taken on the field do not communicate with each other, and so there should be readiness from politicians to correct any regulations if they do not comply with the measures, and the other way around applies. So the greatest challenge of this crisis is this. As a society, we do not have such a level of consensus to move forward. There's a majority of people accepting the fact that there's climate change going on and that something has to be made. But the consequences that this crisis has makes this crisis absolutely different from others. So you mentioned the fact of going back to normal. Well, in this case, there's a change that we have to comply with. So we're not going to go back to a status quo, but we are leading to a different situation that we have to accept and to which we have to adapt. And this is something that we cannot learn from the past. We need so we need awareness from the side of society in order to prompt decisions by the politicians. And this is something absolutely new in history. We need to strengthen the social capital, the social cohesion. This has to be supported through communication and a communication policy that strengthens trust. So that detailed communication is pursued, so that no doubts can arise. Because if we have conflicts, answers and reactions will slow down. And you also mentioned the constitutional implications. So we have to avoid conflicts, especially as far as the timeline is concerned, because we have to be quick. So again, I mentioned some deadlines, 2030, 2050. So the question is not that much when we are going to reach those objectives, but rather budgets, because we cannot oblige to reach a specific objectives by 2030, 2040 if we do not have a budget. So we need to define a budget that should not be exceeded. So we have 1.5 degree threshold. We have to realize if the industrial world or the society of a specific country can reach this objective by the aforementioned deadline. But in order to do so, we need a budget and we need measures that have to be progressively implemented in order to avoid drastic decisions. And we also have to adopt now measures, not so much to not to damage future generations, but in order to adapt future generations to the new situation. So this sentiment has to be present in the overall society in order to reach consensus and to promote further consensus in society. So apart from the practical, financial, organizational, and personnel-related requirements, we have the issue of acceptance, which is one of the most important limiting factor right now. We have a social debate right now because well, not all the people have money to install solar panels or heat pumps, for example. So this cannot be implemented by all households. So how can you cope with that? Of course, there's a bright range of measures that can be implemented within the framework of the affordability. Well, gas prices are not going to decrease, and so we have to find alternatives. So the question is, where am I going to invest, and what brackets of the population should be in a position to carry out these investments. So the social dimension is certainly a hot topic in the political agenda, because we have to provide for equal treatment. There are psychological studies underway showing how important it is to reach a high level of consensus without damaging the economic situation of the society. So if we do not have such a consensus, it's going to be increasingly difficult to implement these measures. It may well be that some people have to provide a higher contribution than others. And there's a full debate underway. And this is quite similar to the debate we had in the COVID pandemic, because when something is considered as necessary, how affordable it is and how acceptable it is for a broad part of the society. Otherwise, we will never be able to implement these measures successfully. One very last question, because we are running late. As you said, is it at the end of the day a question of communication, of explaining why we have to do certain things and why we have no other alternatives? Well, this is certainly an important element for accepting such a radical change in society. And well, there's still some potential for climate change. It's clear that we are not doing enough, but there are so many interrelationships that are very difficult to realize and to understand when it's when we are talking about this crisis. And there are some similarities with the COVID pandemic, but also some differences. Well, during the COVID pandemic, our goal is to foster trust vis-à-vis the public authorities so that the compliance could be increased, and this was considered as good and fair by experts. As far as the climate crisis is concerned, we also have the fact that there are groups of people or individual people who perceive the state as very reluctant to adopting measures for climate change. Well, considering, and if we consider the consequences of climate change as particularly dangerous for me as a person, we tend to consider the government as reluctant. So this is a challenge which is quite different from the usual prevention theory, prevention mechanisms that we have. So how can we accept the action of the state if we consider the state as reluctant, especially among those people who are particularly fearful of the consequences of climate change? Thank you very much for the very lively and interesting conversation. So thank you, Mr. Kurz, thank you, Professor Wollinger, thank you, Mr. Strobl, and Erich Marks, you have the floor. Well, I will be very quick, but before I close, I'd like to say thank you again to the members of the panel. So you mentioned the fact that prevention is never too early and never too late. That's important. And another important thing, if we go back to the picture and to the biker who fell into the river, the question is, what can we do now in terms of prevention? Because if we act late, everything becomes difficult, expensive, complicated, requires a lot of personnel. And then secondly, Mr. Strobl, I think, mentioned that we already have evidence, and everything is evidence-based. But if we wait for the evidence to be there before we act, we run the risk of waiting too long, and then it's too late for adopting measures. So what I mean by that, sometimes we have to act preventively, even though the conditions are not yet in place or are not very clear. So as the mayor said, this is very important also at a municipal level. So thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you have the chance now to complete the picture with your ideas and insights. If you go out and if you log onto our website, you can share the picture too. Then this evening we have our official event. Well, it's usually quite complicated because, you know, it's difficult to give you some indications. If it's too complicated for you, remember, let's meet at 6 at the entry. We have our band. There will be a short demo, and we will follow the musicians, and in a couple of minutes walk, we will reach the venue of the evening event. Then the final event will take place tomorrow on Tuesday. Well, besides the various plenary sessions where we will have the Mannheim Declaration, and then the Präventionsrede. We have a European politician who will talk about the focus for this year, prevention. And then DPT Express. If you do not have a smartphone, you have the information. But if you have any questions about where something is taking place, at what time, you find everything in the under this QR code. And finally, I'd like to wish you a fruitful and interesting conference according to this picture. Thank you very much and see you later.